On the 3rd of March, 1918, the most powerful soldier in the British Empire sat down to complain about the Australians. Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, who commanded every British and Dominion soldier on the Western Front, wrote in his private diary that nearly one Australian in every 100 men was in prison, and that the reason was simple. The Australian, he wrote, refuses to allow capital punishment to be awarded to any Australian. 6 months later, with the war about to be decided and the strongest fortifications ever built standing in their path, thousands of those same Australians would refuse to obey their orders, in the largest series of mutinies the force ever produced, and the most powerful army on earth would be able to do almost nothing about it. When the worst of it finally reached a courtroom, the men were not charged with mutiny. They were charged with desertion. Tell me in the comments, had you ever heard of the Australian mutinies of 1918 before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about courage, discipline, and who is allowed to decide which men are cowards. Now let us go. To understand how a soldier could defy a direct order in the middle of the most important battle of the war and keep his life, you must first understand a single clause of Australian law and the old wound that produced it. The wound was inflicted in South Africa in 1902, in the final year of the Boer War, when 2 Australian officers named Harry Harbord Morant and Peter Hancock were placed before a British firing squad and shot. They had served in an irregular British unit, hunting Boer commandos, and they had been convicted by a British court-martial of executing prisoners. In a dirty corner of a dirty war, where the orders behind such killings were almost never written down. Whether they were murderers or scapegoats has been argued for more than a century. What was never in doubt was the shape of it. Australians had been tried under British military law, judged by British officers, and killed by a British firing squad, while the chain of command above them was never troubled. The young nation, which had federated only the year before, in 1901, absorbed that lesson and resolved that it would never happen again without Australia's own consent. So when the Commonwealth of Australia wrote its founding military legislation, the Defence Act of 1903, it built that resolve into the law. Under that act, an Australian soldier could be sentenced to death for only 4 offences: mutiny, desertion to the enemy, treacherously surrendering a position, and treacherous correspondence with the enemy. And even when a court did pass a sentence of death, it could not be carried out until the Governor-General of Australia personally confirmed it. Throughout the entire First World War, no Governor-General ever did. The numbers tell the story plainly. Across the British Army and its dominions, roughly 306 men were executed during the war, shot at dawn for desertion, for cowardice, for sleeping at their posts, for casting away their weapons. France, which faced enormous mutinies across its own army in 1917, answered them with courts-martial and executions of its own. The Italians revived the ancient practice of decimation, shooting men chosen by lot. Even the Germans, by their own admitted figures, executed dozens. Of all the nations that fought the Great War, exactly 1 shot none of its own soldiers, and that nation was Australia. The number of Australians sentenced to die is still argued over, somewhere between about 115 and 129. The number actually carried out was 0. Australia could make that choice for one reason above all others. Every man in the Australian Imperial Force was a volunteer. Not one had been conscripted. Twice the Australian people had been asked in national referendums to permit conscription for service overseas, and twice they had refused in 2 of the most bitter political fights in the country's history. fights that split the Prime Minister Billy Hughes from his own party and split the nation down the middle. There was something in that fact, in the knowledge that every Australian in a French trench had chosen freely to be there, that made the firing squad feel less like justice and more like betrayal. As Charles Bean would later put it, there was a deep and instinctive horror in the army and in the public alike at the thought of shooting a man who had volunteered to cross the world and fight in a quarrel that was not particularly his own. This produced an army unlike any other on the Western Front, and the difference was visible from the first moment a British officer met it. The Australians did not salute the way other soldiers saluted. By the final year of the war, it was said that saluting had very nearly died out among them. They called their officers by their first names. To the products of the British class system, raised on the absolute authority of rank, all of this looked like the slow disintegration of military order itself. Their own commanders saw it differently. John Monash argued that discipline had been badly misunderstood by men who confused it with ceremony. It did not mean lip service, he wrote, nor obsequious homage to superiors, nor the servile observance of forms and customs. It meant the power to make a great mass of individuals act together toward a single purpose. And by that measure, the only one that counted when the shells were falling, the Australians were among the most disciplined troops in the world. Bean despaired at times of his countrymen, of their drinking and their absences and their endless small rebellions behind the lines. But he believed, and the Germans facing them came to agree, that they would never fail where it mattered. In the assault, under fire, when the work was hardest. They were among the finest attacking troops of the entire war, and they could not be made to obey the way other men were made to obey. For most of 4 years, those two facts lived side by side without colliding. In the autumn of 1918, they collided head-on. The collision came because the war was finally being won, and the winning was consuming the men who were doing it faster than they could ever be replaced. On the 8th of August, 1918, the Allies launched the offensive at Amiens that the German commander Erich Ludendorff would call the Black Day of the German Army. And at the spearhead of it stood the Australian Corps, 5 divisions, the largest single body of troops on the Western Front under one man's command. That man was Lieutenant General Sir John Monash, and he was not the sort of figure the British High Command was accustomed to elevating. He had been born in West Melbourne on the 27th of June, 1865, the son of Jewish immigrants from the Prussian East, and German had been the first language he spoke as a child. He was a civil engineer, a builder of bridges, a citizen soldier rather than a product of the military academies, an outsider to the British officer caste in almost every way. He was also, in the judgment of many who studied the war afterward, its single finest commander, the one general, as the historian A.J.P. Taylor would later write, of creative originality the whole war produced. Monash made his name on a method. His idea of battle was that the infantry should not be flung against the guns to die, but shepherded forward behind a moving wall of artillery fire, with tanks to crush the wire and aircraft overhead to drop ammunition and mask the noise of the advance. Every arm of the army serving the man on foot. On the 4th of July, 1918, at the village of Le Hamel, he had shown the whole method in miniature, taking his objective in about 90 minutes in an operation so precise it would be studied for decades afterward as something close to a perfect battle. He fought in his own mind, as an engineer fights a problem, marshalling men and machines and timetables so that the infantry paid the smallest possible price for the ground they took. It was a humane way to wage a brutal war, and it had made him, by the late summer of 1918, the most trusted pair of hands on the entire Allied front. And yet no method, however clever, could conjure fresh men out of nothing. Amiens was a hammer blow unlike anything seen earlier in the war. Hundreds of tanks moving forward in the dawn mist, the Australians and Canadians tearing a hole miles deep in the German line in a single morning. Then came 100 days of almost continuous fighting, and Monash drove his corps through all of it without rest. At the end of August, his men were ordered against Mont-Saint-Quentin and the town of Péronne, a German bastion on high ground above the Somme that the conventional wisdom said could not be carried by the numbers Monash had left. They carried it anyway, in a few days of savage close fighting at the turn of September, and they won 8 Victoria Crosses in the doing of it, the most Australians had ever been awarded in a single engagement. The cost was severe, and Monash had accepted it beforehand. He had told one of his divisional commanders that casualties at this stage of the war no longer mattered. He did not mean that he had stopped caring. He meant that the enemy was breaking, that a war which had ground on for 4 years might be finished in months if the pressure never let up. The problem was that his soldiers were running out, and there was nothing behind them. Because Australia had refused conscription, the flow of reinforcements had slowed to a trickle. At the same time, the Prime Minister Hughes, reading the exhaustion of the public at home, had ordered that the original 1914 volunteers, the men who had fought and bled the longest, be granted leave to sail home. So at the very moment that the Corps needed every veteran it had, its most experienced soldiers were being put aboard ships. Battalions built to field close to 1,000 men were going into action with a few hundred. Some were down to 150, the strength of a couple of platoons. The Corps as a whole was under strength by as much as half. The British commanders above Monash, Haig, and General Sir Henry Rawlinson offered him the chance to slow the tempo and let his men recover. Monash refused. He had read the enemy correctly, that the Germans were almost finished. The cruelty buried in his own clear-sightedness was that very nearly the same was true of his own men. He chose to keep going, and the men who would have to live inside that choice were never asked. There was one commander in the Corps who understood exactly what the men were worth, because he had spent 2 years refusing to spend them carelessly. Harold Edward Elliott was born on the 19th of June, 1878, in rural Victoria, and he grew into an enormous man, a champion shot putter and a footballer, with a voice that could carry the length of a parade ground and a temper that could clear one. Somewhere in his early service he picked up the nickname Pompey, and although he never much cared for it, it fastened to him for the rest of his life. He had fought as a young man in the Boer War, the same conflict that killed Morant and Hancock, and in peace he built a life as a solicitor in Melbourne and gave his spare hours to the part-time militia. When the First World War came, he was among the first Australians to sail, and on the morning of the Gallipoli landing, the 25th of April, 1915, he was shot through the foot almost the instant he reached the beach. He had the wound dressed and returned to his men. And at the Battle of Lone Pine that August, the soldiers under his command fought through days of savage close-quarters killing, and 4 of the 7 Victoria Crosses awarded in that single engagement went to his battalion. It was on the Western Front, though, that Elliott became the figure his men would follow into anything. In March of 1916, he was given command of the 15th Brigade, and its first major action, at Fromelles on the night of the 19th of July that year, became one of the blackest days in Australian history. Elliott had studied the plan and known it would fail. He said so loudly to anyone who would hear him, and he was overruled. The attack went in as ordered, across open ground against unbroken German machine guns. In a single night, his brigade was torn apart, and the 60th Battalion, one of his own, lost 757 men in roughly 24 hours. Among the dead was Major Geoffrey McCrae, a gifted and much-loved young officer who had served beside Elliott since Gallipoli. A man Elliott cared for so openly that he once wrote that should he himself fall in France, he should like to be buried near poor Jeff. When the survivors came stumbling back out of the line, a witness watched Elliott take their hands one at a time, with the tears running unhidden down his face, and no one who saw it ever forgot it. From that night onward, Elliott led in a way that set him apart. He went up to his forward trenches at first light almost every day, so that the men knew the general had seen the ground he was sending them across. He chose able subordinates and trusted them completely. And above all, he refused, wherever he could, to waste the lives of his soldiers, and they knew it in their bones and loved him for it. He was not rewarded for it in the way he believed he had earned. In May of 1918, he was passed over for promotion to command a division, while 2 of his fellow brigadiers were lifted above him. The bitterness of that denial would, in his own later words, color the whole of his life after the war. But in September of 1918, he was still there, at the head of his brigade, and to the men beneath him, he remained the one general whose word was worth obeying without question. That fact was about to be tested in the strangest manner anyone could imagine. The first sign that the bonds were tearing came on the 14th of September, 1918. The 59th Battalion had just been pulled out of the line after a solid week of continuous operations, and the men had barely settled into the rest they had been promised when the order arrived to turn straight around and go back, to follow up the retreating Germans. 3 of the battalion's platoons simply refused to move. What made the moment extraordinary was the identity of the men who stood with the soldiers. Their own officers, the very people whose authority was being defied, backed them, because those officers could see as plainly as their men that there was nothing left in these soldiers to give, and that they were being ordered to give it anyway. The crisis was talked down within hours. The men were persuaded, the battalion went forward, and the affair might have ended there as a forgotten footnote to a victorious campaign. Charles Bean, setting it down years later, called it the first mutiny in the history of the Australian imperial force. It was not cowardice. Every man caught up in it had proven his courage a dozen times. It was something closer to arithmetic. The plain fact that a human body and a human will can be driven only so far before they refuse. The first crack had opened in a wall everyone had assumed was solid stone. It was sealed over within a day. The pressure underneath went on rising. 1 week later, on a different stretch of the same exhausted front, the wall came apart in earnest. By the middle of September, the Australians had fought their way up to the German outpost line, the forward belt of defenses that screened the main Hindenburg line behind it. The immense system of trenches and tunnels and wire that was Germany's last and strongest hope of holding the war. On the 18th of September, the 1st Division had attacked that outpost belt and succeeded. And 3 days later, its work done, it was being withdrawn for a rest it had bought in blood. It was at that exact moment, with the relief already in motion and tired men already filing to the rear, that the order came down for the 1st Battalion to turn around and go back into the fight. They were to attack once more, to seize a stretch of ground on their flank. And what made it intolerable was their understanding of why. The ground was, as they saw it, the unfinished work of the neighboring British Third Corps, a task that by rights belonged to someone else, and they were being asked to give up their rest and spend their lives finishing it. Again and again through the year, the Australians had found themselves filling gaps the line beside them had failed to hold, finishing attacks that had stalled. Pride and grievance are close cousins, and to be pulled out of a relief and sent back to clean up another corps flank touched the grievance directly. To soldiers who had given all they had, and who had watched their own founding veterans sail home, it landed as the final insult in a long catalog of them. Almost the whole of D Company refused to go. Not one man or two, not a small knot of troublemakers, but very nearly the entire company, standing fast in the field and declining a direct order to advance against the enemy. And then the refusal did the thing that refusals are never supposed to do inside an army. It spread. It moved outward from D Company through the rest of the battalion, soldier passing it to soldier, until men who had lost their own officers in the recent fighting and had no one left to give them orders simply turned in a body and walked back toward the rear. Military law calls this combat refusal, the deliberate declining of an order to fight. And it sits among the very gravest things a soldier can do. It was now happening on a scale the Australian force had never seen in 4 years of war. When the 1st Battalion finally pulled itself together and went forward to do what it had been commanded to do, it advanced with 10 officers and 84 men. Roughly 119 of its soldiers had vanished from the ranks. It remains, to this day, the single largest instance of mass combat refusal in the entire history of the Australian Army. And it left the High Command staring at a question the law of 1903 had made very nearly impossible to answer. What, precisely, does an army do with more than 100 of its finest soldiers when they will not move, and when it cannot shoot a single one of them to put the fear of God into the rest? Before anyone could find an answer, a second order came down, and it turned the refusal of one battalion into the near revolt of an entire corps. On the 23rd of September, 1918, the order was issued to disband one battalion in each of 7 brigades and feed its men into the surviving units as reinforcements. The 19th, the 21st, the 25th, the 37th, the 42nd, the 54th, and the 60th battalions were the units chosen to be wiped from the order of battle. Only the 4 original brigades that had made the Gallipoli landing in April of 1915 were spared, exempted out of respect for what they had come to represent. And the men knew exactly what the order meant, because they had watched it happen before, in an earlier round of disbandments that same year, which had been a painful process for men devoted to their units. From a purely military standpoint, the order was sound, even overdue. The battalions were skeletons in any case, and folding them into fewer full-strength units was the rational thing to do. But the soldiers did not experience it as a rational reorganization. They experienced it as the erasure of everything they had bled for. Because to these men, the battalion had never been a box on an organizational chart. It was the thing they had actually been fighting for, long after the grand purposes of the war had faded into abstraction. A man does not, in the end, die for an empire in the mud of the Somme. He dies for the 200 men closest to him and the number stitched on his shoulder, the battalion that holds the memory and the name of every man who has already fallen wearing it. To be told the battalion would simply stop existing, that its survivors would be parceled out among strangers, felt to many like being ordered to walk away from their own dead. And so, across 6 of the 7 condemned battalions, the men refused. They did not riot. They did not run. They stood still, and they let it be known that they would go on fighting to the last man if required, but that they would do their fighting inside their own battalions and inside no others. There was a terrible elegance in the form their defiance took, because it gave the army almost nothing to grab hold of. There was no ringleader to arrest, no riot to put down, no violence to charge a man with, only thousands of proven soldiers declining, quietly and together to be reorganized out of existence. You cannot court-martial an entire corps. You cannot shoot men for loving the unit they have bled for. This is the moment that has divided historians ever since. In folklore and in part of the official memory, it is gently called a soldier's strike, on the reasoning that the men were not refusing to fight, only refusing to be reorganized. The Australian War Memorial records the harder truth, that mass disobedience to the lawful authority of officers is plainly a mutiny, whatever softer word is laid over the top of it. They were not refusing to fight. They were refusing to disappear. And the whole meaning of what happened lives inside the narrow gap between those two descriptions. Into that gap, in the 15th Brigade, walked the one man the mutineers might actually be willing to hear. The 60th Battalion, the same unit that had been all but annihilated at Fromelles 2 years earlier, losing the better part of its strength in a single night, was the battalion marked for disbandment in Elliott's brigade. And its survivors refused the order exactly as the others were refusing it. The 60th had been raised in Egypt on the 24th of February, 1916, built half from hardened Gallipoli veterans and half from fresh recruits, most of them Victorians, men of Elliott's own state. Across its short and violent life, it had written its record in its own casualties: 701 men killed and more than 1,300 wounded. Now it was being ordered to cease to be. At dusk, with the battalion drawn up on parade and refusing to move, Pompey Elliott went out and stood before his men and spoke to them. We do not know the words he used. They were never written down, and the honest thing is to say so, that the speech itself is lost. But we can measure what it accomplished, because we can set it against everything happening in the brigades on either side. Where 6 battalions had refused outright, the 60th obeyed. The men accepted the order and allowed themselves to be disbanded on the 27th of September, 1918, the only one of the 7 units commanded to disband that did so when it was told. It was not obedience to the army that achieved it. It was obedience to one man, a man who had wept over their dead at Fromelles and had never once thrown their lives away, and who was now asking them, as a personal matter between him and them, to let their battalion go. They could refuse the British Empire. They could not refuse Pompey Elliott. In the other brigades, the deadlock held, and on that same day, the 27th of September, it was Monash himself who gave way. With the assault on the main Hindenburg line only hours off, and a large part of his corps in open refusal, he could not afford a confrontation that might tear the force apart on the eve of the decisive battle of the war. So he postponed the disbandment order, deferring the whole question until after the coming attack. In the most literal sense, the mutineers had won. They had defied a lawful order in great numbers in the face of the enemy, and the commander of the largest corps on the Western Front had backed away rather than break his own army over it. It was a remarkable thing for a man as relentless as Monash to do, and it measured precisely how far the soldiers had pushed him. He needed these men for the battle of his life, and he could not march to it over the bodies of his own mutineers. So he bent. The battalions would all be disbanded in the end, in the reorganization that followed the fighting, but not on the day they had been told to vanish, and not before the men had made their meaning unmistakable in the only language the army could not pretend to misunderstand. And so there remained the unfinished business of the 1st Battalion, of the men who had walked to the rear, and of the question that would not go away. The question of what an army does with soldiers it is forbidden to execute. The answer is the part of the story the records were quietly arranged to disguise. Here is what was actually done. The roughly 119 men of the 1st Battalion who had gone missing were hunted down, gathered up, and put on trial. But they were not charged with mutiny. Mutiny was one of the 4 offenses that carried the death penalty, and to charge these men with it would have forced the Army to confront, in open court and in the permanent record, the thing it least wished to confront, that it could pass sentences of death upon Australians, which it would then never be permitted to carry out. So instead, the men were charged with desertion, the lesser offense, and every one of them but a single soldier was found guilty, and they were handed sentences widely reported at around 10 years of penal servitude. The choice of charge was, in the careful and revealing language of the official record itself, seemingly made to keep the death penalty off the table. Consider what that admission contains. The Army knew it could not shoot these men. It knew any sentence of death would die quietly on the desk of the Governor-General, unconfirmed, as every such sentence had died throughout the war. And so, rather than write the true word, mutiny, into the permanent history, and then stand exposed as unable to act on it, the authorities reached for a smaller word they could actually enforce. And in the end, Monash declined to enforce even those reduced sentences once the guns had stopped, and every one of the convicted men was eventually pardoned and walked out free. To grasp how extraordinary that restraint was, look across to the other side of the same army, where no such law stood between a frightened soldier and the firing squad. Across the British forces, those roughly 306 men were taken out and shot, while the Australians, facing the same terrors in the same trenches, shot not one. In the British system, when a court-martial passed a sentence of death, the papers traveled upward through the chain of command until they reached the desk of the commander-in-chief himself. And from the end of 1915, that was Haig. It was Haig's signature, and Haig's alone, that turned a sentence into a grave. He had complained in his own diary that he could not impose capital punishment upon Australians, and he had pressed the case more than once and been refused every time. And there is a single episode that lays bare, more starkly than any statistic, exactly what that difference meant in human lives. In 1916, at a British military prison in France, a group of prisoners that included several Australians and a New Zealander named John Braithwaite were court-martialed for mutiny after a protest over the brutal conditions in the camp. Every one of them was sentenced to death. The Australians among them were spared automatically by the silent operation of their own nation's law. Their sentences commuted because no one in Australia would ever sign the order that killed them. John Braithwaite had no such protection. New Zealand had written no such reservation into its own terms of service. And so the sentence passed upon him was confirmed by Haig and carried out. On the 29th of October, 1916, John Braithwaite was shot by a firing squad at Rouen. Contemporaries understood it at the time, and historians have argued ever since, that he was made into an example in part to put fear into the very Australians and New Zealanders who were watching, the unruly Dominion soldiers the system could not otherwise reach. A man died. As an example, to frighten soldiers the Army had no legal power to touch. This is the heart of the story, and also the place where the truth has to be handled with care, because the temptation to overstate it is strong. It is often said that the Australian mutinies were hidden, erased, struck clean from the record by embarrassed British officers. That is not quite right, and the real version is more interesting than the myth. The mutinies were not deleted. They were disguised. The truest word for what happened, mutiny, was deliberately exchanged for the safer word, desertion, on the charge sheets, so that the official record describes the affair in language that softens and obscures its real nature. The events were then allowed to settle into the national memory as a strike rather than a revolt. And the British High Command, which came out of the episode looking less like the masters of their own army than they wished, had every reason to let the whole business drift quietly from view. But the events were never truly buried, because Australia's own official historian, Charles Bean, wrote them down, plainly and at length, in the official history of the war. The record was disguised, not destroyed. And the strangest part of the disguise is that it was also, in its own way, an act of mercy. The same legal squeamishness that softened the charge to desertion was the same national instinct that had kept the firing squad silent for 4 straight years. The same refusal to stomach the injustice of putting before a firing squad a man who had volunteered for a war that was never wholly his to fight. The lie in the paperwork and the mercy in the law were the same impulse wearing 2 faces, and you cannot wholly condemn the one without losing your grip on the other. And here is the detail that ought to close the mouth of anyone tempted to call these men cowards. While the lawyers and staff officers argued over what to call them and what was to be done with them, the men themselves went back into the line and broke the Hindenburg line. It is worth saying what that fortress actually was. It was the most formidable defensive system built to that point in human history, a belt of fortifications, miles deep, in concrete and steel, trench behind belts of barbed wire, machine gun posts sighted to cover every approach, and along one stretch the great canal of St. Quentin running through a tunnel beneath the ground. The tunnel turned into a sheltered barracks where the garrison could live safe from any shell fire. It was supposed to be the place where the advance of 1918 finally bled itself white and stopped. The preliminary attack on the outpost line on the 18th of September had already swept up some 4,300 German prisoners. Then came the main assault on the 29th of September against the deepest German defenses. An attack Monash was ordered to direct, with 2 large but green and untested American divisions placed under his command, alongside his own worn-out Australians. The plan was intricate and depended on everything moving on schedule, and almost at once a heavy fog rolled across the battlefield, and the schedule dissolved. The inexperienced American units pushed forward through the murk, and unknowingly walked past German strongpoints, still manned and fighting, leaving pockets of the enemy alive behind the leading waves to fire into the backs of the advance. Bean, watching the careful design come apart, wrote in his diary that by 10 o'clock that morning, Monash's plan had gone to the winds, and that from that hour onward, the offensive was being directed not by the corps commander and his staff, but by Australian battalion and company commanders, fighting it out yard by yard at the front. The men who carried it through, foot by bloody foot, were the same men who, a week earlier, had been refusing their orders and walking to the rear. On the 5th of October, 1918, the last action by Australian infantry in the entire war was fought at the village of Montbrehane. The village was taken by men of the 21st and 24th Battalions, with pioneers, the Army's laborers and builders, picking up rifles and going forward as ordinary infantry because there were no longer enough infantry to go round. With its taking, the Hindenburg line, the fortress all the experts had agreed could not be broken, was broken for good. The Australian Corps was then drawn out of the line, utterly spent, and never returned to battle before the war ended. The bill for that final 100 days came to roughly 27,000 Australians killed or wounded since Amiens, and 11 of the Corps' 60 battalions disbanded for sheer want of men. The convicted mutineers served not a day of their sentences and were pardoned. 5 weeks after Montbrehane, on the 11th of November, 1918, the guns at last fell silent. What happened afterward to the memory of all this is almost as revealing as the events themselves. The mutinies did not enter the national story the way Gallipoli did, with monuments and anniversaries and retellings in every schoolroom. They settled instead into the soft euphemism of the soldiers' strike, half remembered and rarely examined. An awkward episode that refused to take the heroic shape the war was supposed to have. Charles Bean had set himself the task of recording everything, and he did not leave the mutinies out, did not pretend the force had been flawless, set the refusals down on the page where anyone could read them. But a multi-volume official history is not how a nation remembers itself. A nation remembers itself in its statues and its dawn services and the stories it tells its children. And those stories had no comfortable place for more than 100 men who had refused to advance, or for 6 battalions that had told their own commanders no. So the thing was recorded and not remembered, present in the archive and absent from the legend. It took the better part of a century and the patient work of historians before the story was told properly to a general audience. And the thing Australia had actually got right, the refusal to execute its own volunteers, came only slowly to be seen as a point of honor rather than a source of embarrassment. Britain would not formally pardon its 306 executed men until 2006, nearly 90 years after the guns fell silent. New Zealand reckoned with its own executions, John Braithwaite's among them, in the year 2000. Those were long, hard, fought reckonings, waged by descendants and historians across generations to undo what had been done in a few cold minutes at dawn. Australia had simply never had that particular reckoning to undertake, for the plain reason that it had never once pulled the triggers. The 2 men at the center of this story came to endings that could hardly have been more different, and in a way they had always been the 2 halves of the same army. Both were Victorians, both citizen soldiers who had come to war from civilian life, both men the British establishment never fully embraced. But where Monash was cool and calculating, a planner who protected his men by force of intellect, Elliott was all heart and fire, a man who climbed to the front line at dawn and wept over his dead. John Monash was loaded with honors, knighted in the field by his king, and remembered ever afterward as perhaps the finest Allied general the conflict gave either side. When he died in Melbourne on the 8th of October, 1931, something close to 300,000 people lined the streets for his funeral, the largest Australia had ever seen. Pompey Elliott's ending was darker. The grievance over the division he was never given never loosened its grip, and the deeper wounds of the war never fully closed. On the 23rd of March, 1931, a few months before Monash, Harold Elliott took his own life. He was 52 years old. But there is one image of him that belongs at the close of this story. In January of 1919, with the war over and the army winding down, Elliott assembled his brigade one last time to thank them and say goodbye. And after he had finished, with no order given and no man requiring it of them, the battalions formed up of their own accord and marched past his headquarters, cheering him as they went. These were men famous across 2 armies for refusing to salute, for defying lawful orders, for walking to the rear the moment they had decided they had given enough. And they chose, freely and for no reason but love, to honor the one commander who had never treated them as men to be thrown away. That was the purest verdict any of them ever delivered. The real history of the Australian War is written in the distance between 2 facts that ought not to be able to live in the same men. The first is that these were among the finest soldiers the world had ever sent into battle. The troops who took Mont Saint-Quentin against the odds and finished the work of the Hindenburg line after the careful plan dissolved in the fog. The second is that these same men mutinied, refused their orders, walked away from the fight, and were branded in the permanent record as deserters. for no better reason than to keep them clear of a firing squad they could never lawfully have faced. Field Marshal Haig looked at them and saw only indiscipline, a force that filled its own prisons because it would not allow its men to be shot. But what he called indiscipline was something he could never bring himself to understand. A young nation's flat and immovable refusal to execute the volunteers it had sent halfway around the world to fight in a quarrel that was not particularly their own. That refusal is the reason these men lived to be pardoned, lived to march home, lived to cheer an old general one last time. They had stopped saluting somewhere in the long middle of the war, and they would stand frozen under a lawful order and then fight to the death under no order at all. And the one thing they would never do was accept that men who had given everything they had could be written down as cowards. They were not deserters. They were soldiers. The battalions that refused to vanish vanished anyway. John Braithwaite died to frighten the men the army could not reach, and Pompey Elliott survived the whole of the war and could not survive the peace. If you believe these men were soldiers and not cowards, say so in the comments below. And if you want to understand how the men who actually win wars are so often failed by the very people who command them, watch this next.